I sat at the head of my own birthday table, staring at the flimsy paper plate set in front of me. My daughter-in-law's smile was sweet, her voice sharper than the silverware I wasn't trusted with. Paper. After selling my wedding band to cover Ryan's car. After co-signing the mortgage that bought them this house. After 64 years of being his mother, I was disposable. So when the courier knocked with the foreclosure notice, it wasn't just their door that cracked open. It was the truth. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Linda tugged the collar of her cardigan as she stepped out of her car, the late afternoon sun dipping behind the stucco roofs of Cypress Grove Estates. The neighborhood smelled like lawn clippings and privilege, two things she'd never had much use for. Ahead, Ryan and Kelsey's white brick colonial gleamed like a magazine spread. Balloons fluttered lazily from the porch railing. A paper banner spelled "Happy Birthday, Mom" in peeling gold letters. She climbed the stone steps, gift bag in hand, her own gift, purchased and wrapped by herself, because no one had asked. The door opened before she could knock. "There you are," Kelsey chirped, her arms spread wide. "We thought maybe you got lost." "I know the way," Linda said, stepping inside. The scent of roasted meat, candles, and something expensive filled her nostrils. It clashed with the dull ache already rising in her stomach. The living room was staged to perfection. Cream walls, white orchids, monogrammed pillows. Guests were already sipping cocktails and laughing, clustered in polished little knots of conversation. Ryan stood near the fireplace, loosened collar, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't offered her. "Happy birthday, Ma," he said, kissing her cheek without warmth. "Thanks," she said, searching his eyes. Nothing there but vague discomfort. He turned back to the group before she could reply. Kelsey ushered her toward the dining room. "Dinner's ready," she announced brightly like she was hosting a charity gala. The table was exquisite. Tall candles, folded linen napkins, a crystal bowl of salad glistening with vinaigrette. 10 settings, 9 with fine china rimmed in silver, 1 with a flimsy floral paper plate. Linda stared at it. "We figured it was safer this way," Kelsey said, smiling wide. "Don't want anything broken." Her voice dripped honey, her eyes sliced glass. Someone coughed. A guest shifted in their chair. Forks scraped plates, too quickly, too loudly. Ryan chuckled, low and tight, like he didn't know where else to aim his face. He didn't look at his mother. Linda's chair screeched as she pulled it out. The paper plate crinkled beneath her hand as she sat. She folded her napkin carefully in her lap. Her smile was flawless, practiced. It felt like a mask someone else had sewn on. Conversation resumed in halting starts, then picked up speed. Weather, kids, someone's new Peloton, a weekend in Napa. No one looked her in the eye. She nodded politely, asked follow-up questions, complimented the roast. Her voice never trembled. Her spine stayed straight. But beneath the surface, something inside her coiled, tight, quiet, mean. She stared at her reflection in the water glass. 64 years old, widowed, a mother, a grandmother. And here she was, being served like a guest of no consequence at her own birthday dinner. They thought she didn't notice, that she wouldn't make a fuss, that she'd be grateful just to be included. They were wrong. As laughter bloomed down the table, Linda sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on her untouched salad, her fork hovering like a held breath. The room blurred slightly at the edges, but not from tears, from clarity. This dinner, this plate, this family she had poured herself into, had just drawn a line, a bright, sharp one. And on the wrong side of it, she sat alone. Next year, she thought, they won't have the chance to serve me anything at all. The paper plate was still folded in her purse. Linda set it down on her kitchen counter like it might stain the granite. The corners were bent, grease spots blooming in the center like ghosts. She turned away from it, switched on the kettle, and peeled off her cardigan in the same motion. Her small craftsman home was still, silent in a way that felt earned, modest furniture, hand-me-downs, and memories arranged with care, not budget. She padded barefoot to the hallway closet and pulled down a cracked plastic box labeled Ryan, School, in faded Sharpie. It hit the coffee table with a dull thump. Inside, photo albums, flyers from high school plays, honor roll certificates, a dried-out boutonniere from prom. She flipped past them until her fingers stopped on a photograph. Ryan at 16, lanky, unshaven, cradling a letterman's jacket he'd never worn. She remembered that week. 3 tutoring gigs, 2 waitressing shifts, and selling her grandmother's necklace to make rent after Ryan's car broke down on the same day tuition was due. She'd gone to bed with Advil and a bottle of off-brand gin, her knuckles sore from scrubbing baseboards. She kept turning pages. Another photo. Ryan in a cap and gown, arms draped around Linda and Kelsey. Kelsey wore white, smile tight, eyes ambitious. Linda reached under the table for a second file. Bank statements, mortgage documents. The file folder was labeled Pine Hollow Property. She flipped to the co-signature page, her name in neat, careful ink beside Ryan's. The memory was crisp. Kelsey had poured her a glass of wine that afternoon, cooing about starter homes and building equity. She'd called it a little help. Linda had believed her. She pulled a calculator from the drawer and typed in figures slowly, like she was reweighing old lies. Principal, interest, property taxes, homeowner's insurance. Her retirement account had stopped growing 3 years ago. The needle hadn't moved since she gave them that down payment. A key turned in the front door. Barbara's voice called out, gentle and familiar. "You home, hun?" Linda blinked, snapped the file shut, and brushed invisible crumbs from her lap. "In the living room," she answered, voice steady. Barbara appeared a moment later, holding a grocery bag and a sheet cake from the corner bakery. "Heard there was a birthday," she said. "Didn't want you celebrating alone." "I wasn't alone," Linda said, smoothing her hair. "But thank you." Barbara glanced at the photos, the papers, then back at Linda. "How'd it go?" Linda hesitated. Her mouth opened, but no answer came. Barbara sat beside her, hand on hers. "Was it bad?" Linda gave the smallest nod. They sat in silence for a moment, the kettle screaming faintly in the background, ignored. "I never should have helped them buy that house," Linda said finally, almost a whisper. Barbara's eyes narrowed, not from confusion, but concern. "What do you mean?" "I mean..." Linda looked down at her lap, her voice low, acidic. "They don't know who really owns it." She stood abruptly, went to the kitchen, and turned off the kettle. Barbara called after her gently, "What would you even do if they did know?" Linda didn't answer. Instead, she reached back into her purse, pulled out the paper plate, and placed it on the counter beside the cake. Her gaze lingered on the floral pattern, the oil stain that mirrored the shape of a steak she hadn't touched. Then she pulled open a drawer and took out a black Sharpie. Across the plate, in jagged block letters, she wrote, "Taxes due." The wind cut harder downtown, slicing through Linda's coat as she stepped into the warmth of the Cleveland First Regional Bank. The tile floor echoed beneath her boots. A row of holiday poinsettias wilted under fluorescent lighting. A toddler whined in the corner while his mother filled out a loan form with weary fingers. Linda approached the reception desk and cleared her throat. "I have a 10:30 with Mr. Dalton." The teller nodded, made a quick call, then gestured toward a hallway. "He's expecting you, Ms. Halpern." Her heels clicked softly down the corridor. Past framed certificates, past success stories in cheap frames, past the life-sized cutout of a smiling couple holding keys in front of their new home. Linda exhaled just once before knocking. "Come in," said a voice, clipped, precise. She entered. Mr. Dalton rose from behind a polished desk. 60s. Glasses with wire frames. Wedding band, but no warmth. The kind of man who calculated value before character. "Ms. Halpern," he said, extending his hand. "Please, have a seat." She settled into the leather chair opposite him and placed a worn folder on his desk. It looked too small to contain what it actually held. "I need you to look at this," she said, sliding it forward. He opened it without hesitation, adjusting his glasses. Mortgage contract, signatures, proof of co-ownership, refinance terms, amended escrow statements. Dalton skimmed, then paused. His eyebrows ticked up. "You're still listed as the primary guarantor." "I know," Linda replied. Her voice didn't shake, though her hands twitched against the armrests. He continued flipping through, humming softly to himself, until he found the amortization schedule. "You signed on as a 50% equity partner when they refinanced in 2019. Not a gift, not a co-signer, a full legal co-owner." "I know," she repeated. Dalton leaned back. "Ma'am, I'm going to be frank with you. If you chose to trigger foreclosure proceedings, it would crush them. Publicly. Ryan's credit would be obliterated. His wife's, too. The house would go to auction. And unless they can make up back payments..." He trailed off. Linda looked up. "Back payments?" Dalton narrowed his eyes, checked the system. He clicked once, twice, scrolled. 2 months delinquent, he said. Third on the horizon. A beat passed. He looked back at her. "You didn't know?" Linda said nothing. In her purse, she felt her phone buzz, probably a reminder for her annual dentist checkup. She ignored it. Dalton folded his hands. "I don't know what's happened between you and your son, but if you're considering this route, it's not something to approach emotionally." "I'm not emotional," Linda said, quieter than before, but steel lining her tone. "I'm informed." A silence settled, heavy as snowfall. He opened his drawer, pulled out a pamphlet titled Foreclosure and You, and slid it across the desk. "If you want to initiate proceedings," he said, tapping the pamphlet, "you'll need to issue a formal notice of intent to collect or sell your equity. If they can't buy you out, the house enters review. From there, it's 30 days before formal notice, 60 until auction, unless reversed." Linda stared at the paper. Dalton watched her closely. "This kind of leverage," he said carefully, "usually never gets used." She didn't reply, just reached into her purse, pulled out a pen, and underlined the phrase, "Notice of intent to sell equity," with a steady hand. Outside, snow was starting to fall, thin flakes swirling between the buildings, melting the second they hit pavement. But as Linda stepped out of the bank and onto East 9th Street, the cold didn't touch her. She looked up. Snow dusted her hair, caught on her lashes. It felt like applause, whispered only for her. Her fingers found the paper plate folded into a side pocket of her coat. She didn't take it out, just touched the edge, as if to make sure it still existed. That it had happened. They had taken her money, her trust, her silence. And they had forgotten to pay the damn mortgage. By the time she reached her car, she wasn't thinking about birthdays or photo albums or who cut the cake. She was thinking about signatures and consequences. The screen glowed bluish in the early dark, casting long shadows on the kitchen wall. Linda sat hunched at the table, her tea cooling beside her untouched. She scrolled slowly, her thumb deliberate, like dragging a scalpel across something she needed to bleed. Kelsey Halpern. "Brunchin' with my forever loves. Grateful fuck Cleveland Heights. 4 champagne flutes. Three blondes in cashmere. One marble countertop. Linda paused, frowned. She knew that island. That was their kitchen. Another post. Grind now, glow later, above a photo of Kelsey in aviators, perched in the front seat of a Range Rover. Linda blinked at the caption. It wasn't that the lie surprised her. It was the shamelessness, the range of distance between what Kelsey posted and what Linda now knew. The house behind her was 2 months in the red. A new video. Ryan on the golf course, grinning at the camera. "Makin' time for what matters," he said into the lens. He'd tagged a whiskey brand. Promo content. No hint of stress in his swing. No sign of urgency. Linda locked the phone, set it face down, and stared at the silence pressing against her window panes. Outside, the neighborhood was strung with early lights. Plastic Santas, twinkling reindeer, flickering icicles on porches. Christmas always came early on Montrose Street. The voicemail notification blinked. One new message. She tapped play, knowing the voice before it spoke. "Hey, Mom," Ryan said, casual like it wasn't hard. "Just wondering if you could float us a little loan, just to cover December. Kels says hi, we'll pay you back after the holidays. Love you." No apology, no context, just expectation. She deleted it without a word. The room felt colder after. Barbara stirred cream into her coffee, watching the swirl with far too much focus. "They're still asking?" Linda nodded, pushing a sugar packet across the table until it folded in on itself. "I swear," Barbara said. "It's like they think you're a vault with legs." Linda didn't smile. "You've been their safety net too long." Barbara continued gently. "When do they learn to land on their own?" Linda thought of the signature line, the missed payments, the brunch hashtags, the unbothered golf swing. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. "They're not kids anymore, honey," Barbara said. "They're renters in a house they pretend to own." The words hung between them. Later, at the Christmas market, the smell of roasted nuts and pine sap wrapped the square in warmth. Carolers in wool scarves swayed in front of the gazebo, harmonizing off-key. Children tugged their parents toward cider stands and hand-carved ornaments. Laughter rang like wind chimes through the crisp air. Linda walked slowly, weaving between stalls selling beeswax candles, maple toffee, hand-knit mittens. Her bag held a few small things. Nothing for Ryan. Nothing for Kelsey. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow like it had been waiting for her. She paused at a stall selling wooden signs, rustic slogans burned into sanded cedar. "Family is forever. Love grows best in little houses. Bless this mess." She read each one and felt nothing. A young couple beside her held hands, their matching coats dusted in snow. They laughed as they picked a sign together. Something about dogs and love. The woman was pregnant. The man kissed her temple. Linda stepped back, letting them through. She could feel it, beneath her coat, beneath the polite smile she wore for strangers. The loneliness was sharp. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. Like a pressure front that never lifted. No husband to wrap lights on the eaves. No grandchild's hand tugging hers. No real family celebration waiting at home. Only a Sharpie-marked paper plate. And a folder of documents no one else knew she had. She turned from the sign stall, her hands tightening around her bag straps. Across the square, children danced in a line, chasing a red balloon that bobbed above them like hope. Linda didn't follow. She walked away from the noise, from the lights, from the illusion of peace on earth. Her boots left shallow prints in the new snow. By the time she reached the street, her eyes were dry, her spine was straight, and her mind was sharp. She wasn't their safety net anymore. She was the storm coming for the roof. The frost spread in tight, crystalline veins across the windshield, lit pale orange by street lamps as Linda guided the car slowly down Cypress Grove Lane. The houses here, Ryan's neighborhood, sat proud and identical, like teeth in a grin. Garlands wrapped around white columns, trees glowed in front-facing windows, each one fighting for attention with LED icicles and blinking reindeer. She'd driven this road hundreds of times over the years, back when she was still allowed in the front door. Back when her casserole dishes didn't come home empty, and her presence didn't require justification. Tonight, she kept the headlights off. Ryan's house came into view, impossible to miss. Every window spilled gold. Candlelight shimmered on glass. A speaker hidden in the landscaping piped out instrumental Christmas jazz, polished, expensive, hollow. She pulled to the curb across the street and let the engine idle, heater off. Her breath fogged the interior in soft pulses. Inside, the party looked like a commercial. People wandered through the open concept space, drinks in hand, laughter bouncing off the hardwood floors. Kelsey stood near the fireplace, radiant and curated, her red satin dress catching the light like lacquer. She turned, lifted a sparkling flute, and tapped it gently against a spoon. The crowd quieted, obliging. Kelsey began handing out gifts with regal precision. Each one wrapped perfectly in matte paper, tied with velvet ribbon, topped with sprigs of rosemary and dried citrus. She presented each box like a game show prize, posing with guests as they opened candles, luxury teas, and custom stationery. Linda watched as Kelsey laughed, mouth open, head tilted, eyes sparkling with the practiced shine of someone who thought life owed her applause. Ryan lingered by the kitchen island. His eyes scanned the room but never once drifted toward the window, toward the street, toward the woman who had once sold her wedding band to make his first car payment. He looked like a man perfectly comfortable in a world he didn't build. Linda didn't blink. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers tight. The knuckles had gone white without her realizing. She could still see the trim she'd painted in that house. The brush strokes were hers. She remembered the day she had come by with groceries and cleaned the oven without being asked. She remembered fixing the curtain rods Kelsey had hung crooked, patching drywall, pulling weeds, replacing light bulbs. She remembered when they first moved in, how she'd stood in that very living room, paint roller in hand, Ryan saying it felt too beige, and Kelsey nodding like she had taste, like she'd earned anything in her life. Linda had smiled through it. She'd handed over a check, called it a gift, signed her name to the mortgage with a handshake and a prayer. She'd believed they'd keep her close, remember the sacrifices, honor the bond. Instead, they hosted parties she wasn't invited to in a house she partly owned. A fresh peal of laughter broke through the glass. Kelsey was taking selfies now, her phone held high, cheeks flushed with wine and admiration. Guests leaned in. Ryan joined the edge of the group, grinning. Still, he didn't look toward the street. Linda flexed her jaw. The ache in her hands crept up her forearms now. She unclenched, but the steering wheel had already left its mark. Outside, snow had started again. Flakes spun under the lamplight, catching briefly before vanishing into the night. The front door opened and a guest stepped out to smoke. The porch light flickered over his shoulders. He didn't see her. None of them ever did. The door swung shut behind him, sealing the party inside. Linda turned slightly toward the house, eyes narrowing. There was a time when she'd have knocked, when Ryan would have come out in slippers, smiling awkwardly but happy to see her. That time was dead. Now, she was an audience to their fiction. They weren't thriving. They were acting, pretending they weren't 3 months behind, pretending the woman sitting in the dark across the street hadn't funded the fantasy. Linda leaned forward, eyes never leaving the window, and whispered into the silence, "You're laughing on borrowed time." She stayed just a moment longer, long enough to let the words settle. Then she shifted the car into drive, eased away from the curb, and disappeared into the quiet. Behind her, the house continued to shine, but she knew the bulbs would burn out, the laughter would dim, the party would end, and when it did, they'd remember the one person who hadn't smiled. The office park looked colder than usual, just glass and steel under a pewter sky, each pane reflecting a day that hadn't decided if it wanted to snow or rain. Linda pulled into the visitor slot and cut the engine. Her hands remained on the steering wheel, resting, not shaking, but only just. She reached across the center console and picked up the manila folder. It felt heavier than paper should. Inside, the lobby hadn't changed. The poinsettia on the desk was fake. The bowl of candy was untouched. The receptionist offered a polite nod, then buzzed her through without small talk. Dalton's door was already open. He stood behind his desk, sleeves rolled, eyes unreadable. "You're early." Linda stepped in, closed the door behind her. "I didn't sleep." A beat passed. He motioned toward the chair across from him. She sat, placing the folder on the desk between them like a sealed confession. Dalton opened it, flipped through the pages. His eyes didn't linger on any single line. He knew what was in there. They'd reviewed it together 3 times already. "This makes it official," he said. "There's no reversal without penalties." Linda's jaw moved, just once. "They canceled Christmas before I ever did." Dalton nodded once. No argument, no comment. Just the gravity of consequence. He reached for the red stamp, pressed it into the ink pad, and brought it down on the first page. The sound cracked across the room. He slid the folder back toward her. "It's in motion." Linda gathered it slowly, as if touching something freshly broken. She didn't thank him. Gratitude had no place here. Outside, the air smelled metallic. A light mist floated under the low clouds. Not quite rain, not snow either. Just indecision in the form of weather. She crossed the sidewalk and turned toward Main Street on foot, drawn by something she couldn't name. Ahead, a group of carolers stood beneath the overhang of the old hardware store. 4 voices, layered and bright, carried through the cold. "Sleep in heavenly peace." The words hit like a bruise. Linda froze just out of sight, watching their breath bloom in the air as they sang. They were young, earnest, wrapped in scarves and mismatched gloves, shaking jingle bells and smiling like it was still a world worth believing in. Her hand found her coat pocket. Her fingers closed around the old Timex. She pulled it out, held it against her chest. The leather band was worn smooth at the edges, the face scratched, unmoving. Her husband's watch hadn't ticked in years, but she kept it close. It steadied her now. The carolers shifted songs, something upbeat and cheerful, but she didn't hear the tune. Her mind was already elsewhere, on signatures, on dollar amounts, on the ripple that would soon reach Ryan and Kelsey's glittering doorstep. This was no longer theory. It was action. The match had been struck. She turned from the singing without a word and walked back to her car. At home, the house was silent. The kind of silence that didn't invite comfort. She left the file on the passenger seat and went straight inside, kicking off her boots in the hallway without care. In the back closet, hidden behind the vacuum and a bin of tangled Christmas lights, was an old cardboard box. It hadn't been touched in years. She pulled it out, dragged it across the tile, and sliced it open. Inside were folders, receipts, insurance forms, everything most people throw away. Linda didn't. She kept records. Always had. She dug deeper, past old statements and warranty slips, until her fingers found a clear plastic bag. Inside, a flash drive. Black. Unlabeled. She stood, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom. It was all still there. Bank statements, loan co-signatures, transfers Ryan had hidden under joint accounts, messages from Kelsey's burner number. All of it backed up, duplicated, dated, indisputable. Linda crossed to the kitchen, laid the flash drive on the counter like a detonator, and stared at it. For the first time in months, she smiled. Not out of joy, out of certainty. The fuse wasn't just lit, it was racing, and she knew exactly where it would end. The bedroom ceiling was silent and endless, just faint shadows from the window playing tricks on the plaster. Linda lay flat beneath the quilt, eyes open, breath shallow. Hours had passed, maybe more. Sleep hadn't come. The house creaked around her, old wood shifting under cold, the kind of night where every sound feels like a question. She turned onto her side, clutching the edge of the blanket like a ledge. Her mind wouldn't quiet. Ryan at 5, grinning on the front lawn, dirt on his jeans, one sock half off, waving a bent plastic sword. Ryan at 12, arms crossed in defiance but crumbling when she offered ice cream. Ryan at 17, getting into the Civic she helped him buy, that same dumb smirk she used to call his tell. He had her hands, same knuckle shape, same uneven nail beds, and yet, she stared at the darkened window. Regret throbbed behind her ribs. What if this was too much? What if he didn't see it as betrayal because he was cruel, but because he really didn't know? Had she failed to teach him? Had she made him this way by giving too much, too soon, too often? Linda sat up. Her fingers hovered over her phone on the nightstand. Dalton's contact was already open. One tap would pull the brake. Her thumb trembled. Before she could press it, the door cracked open. Couldn't sleep? Barbara's voice was quiet, just above a whisper. She wore a robe that didn't quite close over her belly and carried 2 mugs, one steaming, one shaking slightly in her hand. Linda looked away, wiping at her face before the tears made it obvious. Didn't mean to wake you. Barbara handed her a mug, settled into the chair by the window without asking. They sat like that for a while. Then Barbara spoke. I once let a man treat me like a doormat because I thought love meant always forgiving. Linda kept her eyes on the floor. You know what I got for Christmas that year? Barbara's tone was flat, even. A toaster. In the box. Price tag still on. Linda exhaled a shaky laugh through her nose. She didn't trust her voice. Barbara leaned forward. Love's real, but respect? That's earned and kept. Or it's not real at all. Outside, a wind picked up. The window pane trembled just for a second. I keep thinking maybe I did something wrong, Linda whispered. Barbara's answer came fast. You did. You gave them everything. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was solid, like stone cooling in place. Later, when Barbara went back to bed, Linda stayed behind. She opened her old journal, one she hadn't touched in a year. Her handwriting had changed. That surprised her. She wrote, I gave everything. They gave me paper plates. The pen dug into the page too hard, but she didn't stop. She closed the journal and slid it under the bed, as if sealing a chapter. By morning, the world outside had turned white. Snow blanketed the yard, the mailbox, the cracked walkway she always meant to fix. The tree limbs bowed gently under the weight, silent and certain. She stood by the window in thick socks and watched the streetlight glint across the powder. The sharp, frozen quiet of it all, undisturbed, felt like a kind of truth. This wasn't revenge. It was reckoning. She reached for her phone. Not to call Dalton, to message a name she hadn't typed in a long time. Do you still have the photos from Ryan's birthday? The last one at the cabin? 3 dots appeared, then paused. Her reflection in the glass didn't blink. She had remembered something he'd forgotten. The knock wasn't gentle. It rattled the pane beside the front door like someone testing glass for weakness. Linda wiped her hands on a dish towel and set her mug in the sink. Snow was still melting off the gutters, trickling in thin lines down the siding. She walked to the door without hurrying. When she opened it, Ryan stood on the porch, jaw tight, fists jammed into his coat pockets like he didn't trust them not to fly. "You serious with this?" he said. No greeting, no hesitation, just heat. Linda didn't move. "You're early for Christmas." His eyes narrowed. "You've been talking to people, poking around. You think I wouldn't hear?" She stepped aside. "You came all this way. At least come in." He hesitated, but the wind was sharp, and his pride apparently didn't extend to frostbite. He stomped the snow off his boots and crossed the threshold. Linda walked ahead of him to the kitchen, put the kettle back on the burner like it had been waiting. "Tea?" He looked at her like she'd offered arsenic. "I don't need tea, Mom." "I didn't offer money." His jaw flexed. That particular clench she'd seen since he was a boy, right before he used to lie about test scores or deny breaking the living room lamp. She poured hot water over a bag of Earl Grey, watching the color bloom. "I know about the missed payments," she said, calm, like commenting on the weather. Ryan blinked. The bluster softened, just briefly. What?" Linda turned to face him, leaning her hip against the counter. "You're behind. 3 months. Probably 4 now. Taxes haven't been paid either. I'm still listed on some of the joint accounts. Sloppy, but useful." His mouth opened, then closed. Twice. She was supposed to... Vanessa said she handled... He stopped. "You went through my stuff?" "No," she said. "I went through mine." The silence in the room was brittle. He stepped forward. "Okay, listen. This wasn't supposed to happen. It got ahead of us. You could have just called. We could have fixed this before." "I did call," Linda interrupted. Her voice didn't rise, but it landed harder. "For a year. I left voicemails. I sent cards. You answered with silence." "That was Vanessa." "No," she snapped. "It wasn't just her. You chose her silence over my voice. You let it happen." He looked away. His breath fogged slightly in the cold draft from the door. Linda crossed the room, set his tea in front of him even though he hadn't asked for it. "You stood on that front porch last year and told me I was embarrassing. You said I didn't know when to quit." "That was... Jesus, I was angry." She nodded once. "So am I." He flinched but said nothing. "You need help," she said. "But not the kind I'm giving anymore. I gave when it mattered. When it counted. When it was your first car and your college apps and you getting your feet under you." She stepped back from the table, arms folded. "But now? You're not lost. You're entitled. And I didn't raise that." Ryan's ears went red. "You'd let us lose the house? Let your granddaughter live through that?" The word struck. It was meant to. Linda's face didn't change. "You remember what you said the night you uninvited me to the party? You don't belong in our life anymore." "That's what you said." Ryan's mouth opened, but nothing came. "You told me I wasn't wanted," she said softly. "And that was that." He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping sharp across the tile. His boots thudded down the hall toward the door. "You're unbelievable," he muttered, slamming it behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Linda didn't follow. She moved to the living room window instead, peeling back one edge of the lace curtain. Outside, Ryan crossed the icy walkway toward his car, shoulders hunched, steam rising from his breath. He didn't look back. Linda let the curtain fall. She didn't blink. In the silence that followed, the kettle whistled, high and thin, like a scream held just out of reach. The first time she noticed it, Linda was reaching for a can of tomatoes in the grocery store. 2 women near the dairy section paused their conversation just long enough to make eye contact, then quickly pretended to study a shelf of yogurt. One of them tilted her phone so the screen wasn't visible. Linda said nothing. She adjusted her scarf and moved on. The checkout line wasn't better. The teenage bagger gave her that strained half smile, the kind people wore when they'd been told a story but didn't know if it was true. The cashier, a woman Linda had seen every Thursday for a decade, avoided small talk entirely. Outside, the parking lot wind slapped her hard enough to make her blink. It didn't sting nearly as much as the silence behind her. She loaded the groceries without hurrying, letting the cold bite through her sleeves. On the passenger seat sat a printed flyer for the Cypress Grove Ladies' Cookie Exchange, folded neatly in half. She hadn't been invited. Inside her car, she exhaled once, sharp and dry, and turned the ignition. It didn't take long to learn where it started. Barbara had just returned from the post office, cheeks pink from wind and battle. She tossed her gloves on the table, dropped the mail, and grinned. "Kelsey says you've lost your mind," she announced, like it was good news. Linda looked up from the kitchen table. "She tell you that herself?" Barbara snorted. "Please." She told Trish, who told Carol, who told the UPS guy while he was standing in line for eggnog liqueur. Linda folded the dish towel slowly. "Let them talk." Barbara grinned wider. "Damn right. Let 'em choke on it." They clinked mugs without toasting. That night, Linda sat at her desk, sorting through envelopes. Among the utility bills and catalogs was one outlier. A thick white envelope with Ryan's name in the return address. Not handwriting, printed, businesslike. She opened it. Inside, 3 pages, typed and pleading. He wrote about Skylar, about the sleepless nights and the stress, how Vanessa had overreacted, and he'd been caught in the middle. He said he missed her, said he needed her. He ended with, "Please don't do this. You're still my mother." She read it once, then again, then fed each page into the shredder. Slowly, methodically, until it was all just curled strips that meant nothing at all. The next morning, Linda went into the garage. A stack of folding chairs sat dusty in the corner beside the artificial tree and a bin of extension cords. She wiped them down, checking hinges and legs. Then she brought them inside, one by one. By noon, the dining room was rearranged. The table extended, chairs set, placemats laid out like ceremony. Barbara passed by the doorway and raised an eyebrow. "Expecting company?" Linda tucked a final fork into place. "Thinking of having Christmas here." Barbara leaned on the door frame. "You haven't hosted since—" "I know." "You sure you're up for it?" Linda nodded. "I'm not letting them take my table, too." Barbara's voice softened. "Who you thinking of inviting?" Linda didn't answer right away. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a pad of stationery, the good kind, thick enough to feel like something. "Marjorie down the block. She lost Joe in August. Still puts his slippers by the door." She scribbled the name, then added another. "Mrs. Ames. That son of hers never came back from Florida." Barbara stepped into the room, took a seat, and grabbed a pen. "I'll call Mildred. She hates her kids." They wrote for an hour. That evening, Linda stood by the window, watching fresh snow fall over the lawn. The lace curtain brushed her wrist like a breath. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. By herself. Most of all. Behind her, the kitchen clock ticked, steady and unfazed. And upstairs, in a file folder marked Cabin 2007, Photos, something waited to be opened. The van idled at the curb, its engine puffing pale exhaust into the winter air. A man in a dark overcoat stepped out, briefcase in hand, his shoes crunching over the frozen salt. He didn't glance at the Christmas wreath on the door or the blinking reindeer staked into the yard. He just rang the bell, twice, hard enough to echo down the block. The door swung open, spilling light and heat into the morning. Kelsey appeared first, barefoot in a cream cashmere wrap. For a second she was all gloss and shine, then she registered the papers in the man's hand. "I'm serving notice of foreclosure proceedings," the courier said, crisp and practiced. Her face cracked. No, this is a mistake. She tried to step back, but he was already holding out the envelope. We're not. No. Neighbors had started to pause. A woman with a stroller slowed at the sidewalk. A man walking his dog stopped, tugged at the leash, pretending to check his phone but staring anyway. Kelsey's voice rose, sharp and brittle. You can't just show up like this. This is private. But the courier had already turned, descending the steps, his boots marking wet lines on the concrete. Ryan appeared behind her. He was still in yesterday's shirt, hair flattened on one side from sleep. His eyes darted between Kelsey, the envelope, and the neighbors. What is this? He asked, voice low but fraying at the edges. Kelsey clutched the papers to her chest. You didn't tell me. I didn't know, he said, but it came out more like a question than a statement. Her scream carried out across the yard, high and raw. The dog walker flinched. Someone across the street pulled their curtain closed but stayed there anyway, a silhouette watching through the lace. Ryan stepped outside, bare feet on the frozen stoop, scanning the street like he could will it empty. Get inside, he hissed at Kelsey. But she was already in tears, shaking the papers like a flag of surrender. We can't, Ryan, we can't. He grabbed the envelope from her, tore at it, scanning the legal text as though reading it faster could change the meaning. His skin went ashen. Across town, Linda's phone buzzed on the counter. She let it vibrate itself to silence. Then it buzzed again, and again. By the third voicemail, she was sitting at the table peeling an orange with slow, deliberate fingers. The fruit's scent filled the kitchen. Bright, citrus, clean. She pressed play. Ryan's voice came through, ragged. Mom, you can't. Mom, please. We didn't. Just call me back. Please. She deleted it. Another. Mom, I don't. Vanessa, this is humiliating. We need to fix this. Delete. She set the phone down. The kettle clicked off, steam sighing from the spout. Barbara pushed through the back door without knocking, cheeks red from the cold, a bottle of wine tucked under her arm. She plunked it on the table. Cheers to justice, she said, untying her scarf. Linda arched an eyebrow. You even brought glasses? Barbara pulled 2 tumblers from her coat pocket, grinning. Plastic. Classy, huh? They poured deep and drank, standing at the counter, elbows braced on the formica. The sound of Ryan's next voicemail buzzed on mute, a tiny light blinking and blinking. Barbara raised her glass again. They'll call you names now, but they'll remember who wrote the checks. Linda didn't smile, exactly, but her shoulders eased. Later, she stepped outside with a box of tangled lights. Snow crunched under her boots as she moved along the porch rail, stringing them one by one. The bulbs glowed warm against the blue dusk, catching on her breath when she exhaled. From the street, her little house looked alive again, soft light pooling from the windows, a quiet hum of motion inside. She paused, one strand still in her hand, and looked at the road leading out of town. Somewhere down that road, Ryan was dialing her number again. She could almost feel the vibration before it happened. She reached for the final plug and held it just short of the outlet. The porch glowed half lit, half dark. She wondered how long it would take before he showed up here. Then she pushed the plug into the socket. Every bulb flared at once, spilling gold into the snow. Linda sat alone at the kitchen table, the light from the living room flickering across the darkened corners of the room. The house was quiet now, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The day had unfolded like a dream that was just too hard to believe. Ryan's phone calls, his pleas, the foreclosure papers. Yet, she remained here, still. She didn't feel triumphant or free. Instead, the weight of what had been said, and what hadn't, pressed on her chest like an invisible hand. Her fingers grazed the small stack of old Christmas cards sitting in front of her, resting on top of the box where they had been buried for years. She hadn't planned to open them, not tonight. But the moment her hand brushed against the red envelope, shiny and slightly dog-eared, the memories surged, pushing her into the past. The cards had always been Ryan's project. Every Christmas, he'd signed his name with crayon in the middle of the card, scribbling his best wishes in a hasty, childlike scrawl. Some cards were store-bought, but others were homemade, the kind that came with stickers and glitter, his 5-year-old attempt at creating something special. Linda flipped one open. To the best mom in the world. Love, Ryan. The handwriting was clumsy, but the words, those words, written in crayon, felt so far away, a lifetime ago. She pulled the next one from the pile. Merry Christmas, Mom. I hope you like your present. You're the best. Ryan. The paper was brittle now, the ink faded by time, but the weight of those simple words crashed over her. She remembered the eagerness with which he'd handed her that card, that giddy sparkle in his eyes when he was younger, the small gifts he had wrapped with care and anticipation. He had been so full of hope. A sigh left Linda's lips. It was a soft sound, as if she was letting out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Her chest felt tight, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what she had been fighting for. Was it really justice? Or was it just the last shred of her son that she had been clinging to, hoping that by standing her ground she could somehow reach him again? She turned the page of another card. This one was from his teen years. It wasn't a Christmas card at all, but a hastily written note. She recognized his handwriting even then, more grown-up, less certain. The words spiked with rebellion. Thanks for everything, Mom, but I've got it from here. Don't worry about me. The sharpness of the words pierced through her as if she'd just received a punch to the gut. She could hear the echo of his voice in her memory, resentful, defensive. Her thumb traced the edges of the paper, her mind replaying that moment years ago when Ryan had decided to shut her out. She hadn't been perfect. No one was. But she had given everything. Everything she had. What if it wasn't enough? What if he was right? What if she had been the one to push him too hard, to demand too much of his forgiveness? For the first time, a sliver of guilt pierced through her resolve. It wasn't strong, just a whisper that brushed against her heart. Maybe she had pushed him away first. Maybe it was her fault. She closed her eyes, pushed the thought aside, but it lingered in the back of her mind like a shadow she couldn't escape. Then the door opened and Barbara stepped inside, dragging in the cold. Linda didn't need to look up to know it was her. The comforting scent of tobacco and wine filled the air as Barbara shuffled in, her boots clunking on the wooden floor. You okay? Barbara asked quietly, setting a fresh bottle of wine on the table, unceremoniously opening it. Linda didn't respond immediately. She just kept staring at the cards, her mind working through a fog of emotion she hadn't been ready to face. Finally, Barbara sat down across from her, nodding toward the cards. You know, he made the choice, not you, she said. Her voice was soft, understanding, but firm. You can't fix what's already broken, Linda. He has to want it. And right now, he doesn't. Linda swallowed, but it didn't stop the heaviness in her chest. I want him to remember. Barbara reached across the table, squeezing her hand. He will, in his own time. But that's not on you anymore. The words settled like dust, heavy and real. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but Barbara was right. She couldn't fix this. She could only choose what to do next. Linda picked up a letter she'd kept from years ago. It was from Kelsey, mocking, sarcastic, a note she'd found hidden behind a pile of other papers. A reminder of the woman who'd never made Linda feel good enough. Without saying a word, Linda placed it in the middle of the table. She reached for a match, struck it against the side of the box, and set the corner of the letter alight. The flames flickered for a moment before they caught. Kelsey's words curled into ash. Barbara watched, a quiet understanding in her gaze. Linda didn't speak as the paper burned, but something inside her did. Something she hadn't realized was there until now. When the last bit of the letter was nothing but ash, Linda stood up, walked to the window, and opened it wide. The air outside was cold and crisp. The wind swept through her hair as she leaned against the sill, breathing deeply. For the first time in months, Linda let herself feel free. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, she slept soundly. The weight of the world just a little bit lighter. The oven door creaked open, releasing a burst of rosemary, garlic, and browned butter into the air. Linda wiped her hands on a towel, her cheeks flushed with heat, her sweater flecked with flour. The kitchen looked like a battleground, bowls stacked high, measuring spoons scattered like dropped ammunition, but the war was worth it. Her little cottage was glowing. The dining room table, extended to its full length with 2 leaves she hadn't used in years, was surrounded by a mismatched brigade of chairs. Folding metal ones from the garage, a padded office chair from the back room, even a stool Barbara insisted on sitting on, because it keeps my spine honest. The plates didn't match. The silverware didn't either. One guest would be using a soup spoon for their potatoes, and someone else had a salad fork and a butter knife. It didn't matter. It all felt right. Outside, the porch was strung with warm white lights. Inside, laughter swirled like steam from a mug. The first to arrive had been Marjorie, wrapped in a heavy coat 2 sizes too big, her eyes hesitant until she saw Linda's smile. Then came Mrs. Ames with homemade fudge and a shaking voice that melted after her second glass of wine. A retired veteran from 3 houses down brought a ham he insisted was smoked with love and cherry wood. Barbara showed up late, as usual, carrying a Bluetooth speaker blasting Sinatra. More followed. A divorced kindergarten teacher who had no children of her own. A teenager from the corner house who said her parents were just too busy this year. Even Mildred came, reluctantly, but with homemade cider and the kind of commentary only a woman with 4 ex-husbands and no filter could offer. The house swelled with heat and sound. Music bounced off the low ceiling. Someone began singing, loudly, off-key, and others joined in. Linda stood in the kitchen doorway, dish towel slung over her shoulder, watching them all. No one was dressed to impress. No one performed. These weren't people angling for social media perfection or holiday cards in curated poses. They were here because they had nowhere else to be. And because she had made a place for them. She glanced toward the mantel. No stockings, no garland, just the photo of Jack, her husband, faded and gentle, set beside a flickering candle. The room tilted slightly like her heart was trying to catch up with itself. This wasn't the holiday she used to have. But maybe, just maybe, it was the one she needed. Across town, the house on Cypress Grove Lane was silent. No music, no lights. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, untouched, its needles drooping from neglect. Wrapping paper lay crumpled on the floor from a fight neither Ryan nor Kelsey had bothered to clean up. They hadn't spoken in hours. Ryan sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, scrolling through old photos on his phone. Each swipe brought another holiday snapshot. Linda at the stove, apron on, flour on her nose. Linda wrapping gifts in newspaper and twine. Linda opening a lumpy, hand-knitted scarf he'd made in 3rd grade. Kelsey sat on the other end of the couch, arms folded, staring into the darkened television screen like it might rescue her. The silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was deafening. Ryan stopped on a photo from years ago, him as a kid, standing next to his mother in front of a crooked Christmas tree, both of them laughing. He stared at it for a long time. Back in the cottage, Barbara tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room quieted just enough. Linda looked around at her table, Plates scraped clean, hands clasped in conversation, laughter still bubbling under the surface. She picked up her wine glass. The red caught the candlelight, casting shadows on the wall. "To all of you," she said, voice steady. "Thank you for showing up." Barbara clapped. So did Marjorie. Someone whooped. As Linda raised her glass, her eyes drifted to the frost-covered window. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, slow, unhurried. Each flake catching the glow from her porch lights as it fell. Her hand didn't shake. This time, when she smiled, it reached all the way to her eyes. The doorbell rang just as the conversation was peaking, Barbara telling a story about her cousin's attempt at Christmas turkey last year, the punchline still hanging in the air when the sound sliced through the room like a blade. The chatter faltered. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. For a moment, it felt like a full minute of silence. Linda wiped her hands on her apron, steadying herself. She glanced at the table, half-empty glasses, plates smeared with gravy and cranberry sauce. This wasn't a night for interruptions. But the sound persisted. One more ring, then another, firmer. Without speaking, Linda stood from her chair. The room, suddenly charged with a quiet energy, seemed to hold its breath. The guests exchanged glances, unsure if the moment was to be acknowledged or ignored. When she reached the door, Linda hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. She had imagined this moment in her mind, over and over, her son coming back, apologizing, seeking refuge. But this wasn't the picture she had painted. She opened the door. Ryan stood on the doorstep, the dim porch light catching in his damp hair. Snow had dusted his shoulders, the edges of his jacket soaked from the falling flakes. His eyes were empty, sunken, as though the weight of his world had finally crushed him into stillness. He looked different, thinner, older. His face had lost its sharp edges, the kind she had once fought against so fiercely. He looked like he had been fighting his own reflection for far too long. I need to talk," he said, his voice low, almost ashamed. He swallowed hard, then glanced back over his shoulder as if making sure the world wasn't watching them. Linda said nothing. She studied him, her gaze unreadable like a slow wave inching toward the shore. His eyes met hers, desperate, pleading. Kelsey left. After everything, the foreclosure. She couldn't handle it. I didn't know what else to do." He paused, his words hanging in the air between them like smoke, invisible but thick. Linda felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't move. Ryan looked at her again, this time searching, hoping, as if he thought a word from her might make everything right again. "Can I come in?" His voice cracked on the last word. The cold from the open door wrapped itself around Linda like a cloak. She stood there, unmoving, taking in every detail, the tightness of his clothes, the shift in his posture. He was no longer her son, the eager boy with crayon-scribbled cards. No, this man before her was the one who had walked away, leaving only bitterness in his wake. Linda's chest tightened. She glanced over her shoulder at the warmth spilling from the kitchen, at the table full of faces that had nothing to prove, nothing to hide. She knew where her place was now. She knew what was real. Her eyes, cold but steady, locked onto his. "This table is for those who value it." Her words landed like a weight, thick and true. The silence between them stretched, thin and taut, before she stepped back, barely enough to let him through. Ryan's eyes widened, surprised by the gesture, as though he hadn't expected her to actually move. He took a tentative step forward, his body stiff, like a man unsure if he was allowed to be in a place he had once known so well. The threshold, once so familiar, now felt foreign. Linda closed the door behind him, the soft click resounding in the quiet space between them. For a moment, he just stood there, at the edge of the kitchen, not looking at anyone, not saying anything. The room seemed to shift, just slightly, as the weight of his presence pressed in. He didn't belong here. Not yet. Barbara, who had been the first to speak earlier, stood now at the edge of the room, her glass in hand. She met Linda's eyes, a silent nod of approval. There was no judgment in her gaze, just a quiet understanding. The room, so full of life moments ago, suddenly felt tense, heavy with the weight of what was being repaired. Ryan shifted on his feet, still standing at the edge of the room, like an outsider watching a scene he was no longer part of. Linda reached for her glass of wine, raised it slightly toward the gathering in front of her. She didn't speak, but the gesture was enough. She could hear the soft clink of Barbara's glass against her own. Ryan took a deep breath. The tension hadn't dissipated, but it had shifted. He wasn't just her son anymore. He was a stranger trying to re-enter a life that wasn't his to claim. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Linda didn't feel like she was sinking. Her hand didn't tremble as she took the first sip. Ryan sat at the edge of the table, his hands wrapped around a half-full glass of wine. He hadn't touched the food. He hadn't really touched anything except the glass, which he rotated slowly between his palms. Every now and then, his eyes flicked up to the faces around him, to the laughter and clinking of silverware. But mostly, he just stared down at his hands, as if the weight of the room could be absorbed there. The others had long since fallen into comfortable conversation, Barbara telling a ridiculous story about a fishing trip that had ended in the complete destruction of a kayak. Marjorie asking Mildred about the best way to winterize her garden. They didn't notice him, didn't even acknowledge the empty space he occupied. But Linda noticed. Her eyes lingered on him when she wasn't looking at the others. She didn't look away when he caught her gaze, but she didn't smile either. There was no warmth in her look, just the bare recognition of a man who no longer fit into the life he had once occupied. Ryan swallowed hard and whispered, low enough that no one could hear. "I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant for it to go this far." He wasn't sure if he was apologizing for the foreclosure, or for the years of distance, or the hurt he had caused. Maybe all of it. But the words felt like stones in his throat. Too little, too late. Barbara, who had been watching him from the other end of the table, finally noticed. Her lips quirked slightly, but she didn't interfere. She'd said her piece already. It was Linda's moment now. Her choice. Ryan's eyes shifted to Linda. She was sitting, her posture firm but relaxed, leaning forward slightly as she engaged with the others. Her face was animated, alive with the warmth of shared company. And yet, he could feel the space between them, thick like fog. When he looked at her now, he saw the woman who had once poured herself into him, who had sacrificed her own comfort for his. He saw the hurt in her eyes, but also a quiet strength that seemed to burn brighter than it ever had before. He had been blind to it, wrapped in his own bitterness, his own anger. But now, sitting at this table, with strangers who had somehow found their place in her life, Ryan realized how much he had taken from her, and how little he had given in return. Linda didn't speak immediately. She just met his gaze, long and unblinking, as if weighing something in her mind that she wasn't ready to share. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave him a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was a nod that told him she saw him. That told him he hadn't been erased entirely. But it wasn't forgiveness? Not yet. Not until he earned it. The room felt heavier in that moment. Ryan exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. He didn't expect her to forgive him, not in one glance, not in one nod. But that look, that acknowledgement, it made him realize what he had to do. It wasn't enough to apologize. He couldn't just come back into her life and assume things would fall into place. He had to show her that he had changed, that he could be the person who didn't take from her, but gave. that he could be more than a son who had run when things got hard. As the conversation continued around him, Ryan sat still, his glass forgotten in his hand. He didn't know what it meant yet, but something inside him shifted. The walls he had built up over the years, those walls between him and his mother, between him and everyone, suddenly felt fragile, like they might collapse at any moment. Linda, too, felt the change. She could feel it in the air, the space between them closing just a little. The power had shifted. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the one standing at the edges of her own life, watching it unfold without ever truly participating. She wasn't just holding the pieces together anymore. She was starting to let herself be seen. Her hand didn't shake when she raised her glass again, this time for herself. Her eyes flicked to Ryan before she smiled, but it was brief, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken moment that had passed between them. Across the room, the guests continued laughing, but there was something deeper now, something more genuine in the air. It wasn't just the warmth of the house, or the glow of the lights. It was the understanding that they had all come here, in one way or another, because they mattered to each other. Ryan's throat tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than shame. He wasn't home, not yet, not in the way he wanted to be, but he was here. He was present. And that, somehow, had to be enough. For now. The moment held, just a heartbeat longer than it should have, before Linda turned her attention back to the table, her focus moving back to the warmth and laughter that filled the room. Ryan swallowed hard and looked around, seeing the table, the people, the place he had long left behind. This wasn't his to reclaim. Not yet. But he would earn it. He would. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains, casting long, delicate shadows across the kitchen floor. Linda sat at the table, her mug of coffee warm between her hands, steam rising lazily in the calm air. The house was quiet now. The afterglow of laughter and conversation still clinging to the walls like the scent of freshly baked bread. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world a muted, pristine white. The neighborhood was still, save for the occasional sound of a car starting up, the whoosh of snow being brushed off a windshield. She sat back, taking in the simple peace. It was a good day. Her house, her space, had been filled with people, with warmth, with stories. This year it had all come together. Not the way she had expected, not the way she had once hoped, but in a way that felt right. The doorbell rang, the sound sharp in the quiet. The guests had begun leaving. One by one they filed out, many of them hugging Linda on their way out, thanking her for the meal, for the company. Their words were sincere, not just polite. These were people who had found a place at her table, who had walked into her life without asking for anything in return. And for the first time in a long time, Linda felt like she was seen. Not just as a mother or a provider, but as someone worthy of the love and respect she had given so freely for so many years. When the last of the guests had gone and the door had closed gently behind them, Linda found herself standing alone in the living room. The air felt different now, less filled with the noise of conversation, more weighted with a sense of finality. She turned, and there he was, Ryan, still seated at the edge of the table, his hands resting on his knees, his posture tense. He hadn't moved much since dinner, hadn't seemed to know where he belonged in this place, in this moment. He caught her gaze, his lips parted as if he wanted to say something but no words came. Linda studied him for a long moment, seeing the boy he once was in the man he had become. She had always been able to read him, and now, more than ever, she could see the hesitation in his eyes, the uncertainty of someone who had tried to outrun the past, but had finally found himself face to face with it. "You don't need to go yet," she said quietly. her voice warm but steady. Ryan hesitated, unsure. His shoulders slumped and he looked at the floor. I don't know what to do now. Linda smiled softly. You're here. That's enough for now. He nodded slowly and they stood there for a moment, the space between them still heavy with unsaid things, but also with a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. She reached for the coffee pot, poured herself another cup, and took a slow sip. The warmth of the liquid grounded her. She felt, for the first time in a long time, as though she had done something for herself, for her own peace. She had served more than a foreclosure notice that night. She had served respect. To herself, and to those who mattered. Ryan shifted his weight, glancing around the room, taking in the remnants of the evening, the stray napkins on the floor, the empty wine glasses on the counter. Do you want help cleaning up? He asked, his voice hesitant, as if waiting for her to turn him down. Linda's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she set her cup down. I think I can manage. But thank you. He looked like he wanted to protest, but instead, he simply nodded. His eyes flicked to the window, where the last of the snow was melting in the soft light. I guess it's still Christmas, he murmured. She looked out the window too, watching the slow fade of night into day, the pale light settling on the world like a blanket. It's different, she said, the words barely a whisper, but it's Christmas all the same. Ryan stayed for a while longer, a shadow in the quiet room, not knowing what to say or do, but not leaving either. And Linda, for the first time, didn't feel the need to fill the silence. As he finally made to leave, Linda stood at the door, watching him linger there, a man unsure of the place he once belonged. He hesitated, looking down at his feet before lifting his gaze to meet hers one last time. I'm sorry, Mom, he said again, quietly, his voice rough. Linda nodded, the corners of her mouth twitching upward. I know. And with that, Ryan stepped out into the cold, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. Linda watched him go, a knot of something she couldn't name tugging at her chest. She turned back to the room, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the table. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't what she had expected. But as the last of the guests faded into the night, Linda knew something had changed. She had opened herself to something new, a new kind of family, a new beginning. She raised her cup of coffee to the window, to the snow, and to the warmth she had finally allowed herself to feel.